Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first episode of 21st Century Renaissance. I am your host, Dr. Michael Lopiano, and my guest today is Felipe Dinis. Felipe is joining us from London. Welcome, Felipe.
Hello, hello.
Yes, so here on 21st Century Renaissance, we are thinking actively not about starting a Renaissance 2.0, but of investigating this Renaissance that we are actually living as a part of right now. That's my objective here with this show and with my research. I think that a Renaissance is happening right now, just as the thinkers of the Renaissance, individuals like Renaissance humanists, took advantage of new technology like the printing press and built a parallel infrastructure to the major institutions of the time. We are living amidst a similar revolution in technology with various social media innovations, communications technologies, and a number of very spirited and creative individuals are taking advantage of that parallel infrastructure right now. So Felipe, excuse me, Felipe, Felipe, I am very interested, and I'm very interested to present to my audience here, to our audience here, and to think a little with you and learn from you how you are using this technology to create a bit of parallel infrastructure of your own. I understand you have an Instagram account of several thousand people. You are active on Patreon. I've seen you've been involved in interviews. Would you be able to tell us a bit about how you are building some of this parallel infrastructure yourself?
I think before even discussing that point, there has to be a personal backstory. There has to be regarding how I got into the position of creating content the way I do. Because it wasn't something that, one day I woke up and I thought, oh, I'll just be creative and talk about civilization, talk about religion, And so before even thinking about this content, it was more ironically inner pain. Inner pain was the reason why I got into what I'm doing today. And I actually think it's really important to acknowledge that experience in life, beyond the theoretical, the practical elements of your life is incredibly important in your journey. And so when you're trying to, let's say in the broader sense, you're trying to provide wisdom to an audience, I think it's very important to have some sort of personal experience of you've made some mistakes, Jordan Peterson cliche of I take responsibility. Yeah, you have to take some responsibility to climb the archetypal mountain, let's say. So yeah, inner pain was the reason why I began querying certain things about myself and the world. And without that, I wouldn't be on Instagram the way I am today. So it was pain. And then initially I was more focused on the psychological, but I've started to shift in the last 12 months, I would say, towards a more broader stance, which obviously that's why we're talking today. The stance regarding civilization and how to create a better civilization, let's say.
Okay.
So
yeah. Yes, very interesting. So I'd like to make sure that our audience here understands exactly to the full extent the dimensions that you are involved with social media right now. What sort of content you create? Would you be able to present to them a bit? What do you do? What sort of content do you make?
Well, I try to be as creative as I can be, because when you're online, we're content creators. Technically, you're utilizing a platform like Instagram, like X, Twitter, Patreon. You are trying to be creative as possible. So that's my objective. I'm not an intellectual like yourself, I would say. I'm more a very keen learner, and I do read a lot. But then I try to use the knowledge I've gained in a very creative manner online, whether it's, through filming myself online speaking about a particular topic, or using, ironically, Renaissance art, using even on the Renaissance, artistic creations and creating let's say it's not even poems per se, but it's more a creative stance regarding my view on civilization. And I think the reason why I'm utilizing social media in that particular direction, it's one thing being rational about, okay, 1 + 1 = 2. So if we, put this solution forward, people will take it. That's not the case. People are emotive. People get, there's no point trying to focus on capturing their minds. You need to capture their hearts, their souls. And so I think I'm still trying to be a bit vague, but purposely vague. For me, social media is in a way, especially Instagram, I try to make it as artistic as it can be on that platform. But obviously there is a diagnosis, there is an analysis at the end, but that's my initial goal. So I still have, more analytical pieces on Patreon. I do write a lot. So my recent piece I wrote on Patreon was the fact that Western civilization is actually a product of the Christian value system at the end. So you talk about, you've mentioned humanism. Let's say we can think of all the ideologies in the last 500 years. It all has sprinkles of Christianity. Even Tom Holland makes the claim in Dominion that even communism has the sprinkles of Christianity, which is obviously interesting. So I think that was my recent piece, but bringing that up, I think that's really important for people to acknowledge the foundations of our civilization and where we come from, outside of that, with Patreon, I do write very, very different projects I just released with my fiance, a Proverbs project. It's just a musical project, and it's me narrating and she's singing over the piece. So that's a beautiful project, which I've got a few more pieces to do there. I'm trying to think what else. Pretty much, yeah. I try to be as creative as I can be.
Okay, so you have a number of portals here, right? So you have your Instagram page. I see that you're active on X. You produce video content regularly. You also so you write in particular. I said you mentioned this particular thought piece that you produced after reading Tom Holland's Dominion very recently. I've seen that advertised on your page. Are you also active on YouTube? Do you make?
No. I'm
Okay.
being very patient regarding YouTube, but I rather, yeah.
I can't do too many things at once. That's
yes, correct,
yeah.
correct.
Yes, very good. Okay, so the primary material, it seems, that you draw on seems to be something like a combination of things written, say, from the classical tradition, and as well from some more modern psychological traditions. How did you get interested in this confluence of materials?
Good question. Relevant to my initial point about personal pain, Jordan Peterson, as famous as he is, was actually my gateway towards, the intellectual realm, let's call it that. He was the gateway. And I think he's a gateway for a lot of people, during this time, in the last 5 years, last 6, 7 years, he's been the gateway. So he was the gateway when I was going through a bit of pain. I read 12 Rules for Life, and it's been a long time. It's over 5 years I read the book, but I remember reading the Genesis account. He was mentioning this. I can't remember clearly. I thought, oh well, I didn't really see it that way. And so that was like a rabbit hole. It made me think, So obviously through Peterson, Carl Jung, I had a period that was really into Carl Jung. And just to mention, my page maybe a couple of years back was more coaching orientated. And so paradoxically, using shadow work. But then I realized, reading a ton of his collected works, I didn't see the shadows prominent as people would like to claim in, the new age circles. I didn't see that was my conclusion. And I kind of learned what I needed to learn from Jung, and I've moved on from Jung a little bit. Who else? Emma Gilchrist, he's, you like Ian McGilchrist. I still haven't read the Matter with Things. He's that two-part blocky book, that
Yes.
heavy book. I haven't read it.
It's quite the read. It took me a while to digest that.
I would love to read it,
Very
but yeah.
much worth it. I highly recommend it.
Yes, it's looking at me. I've got a shelf right here, and it's
Very good.
it's looking at me right now. I think Ian McGilchrist definitely influenced the especially using a little bit of neuroscience, and he doesn't utilize the pop. It's not so pop psychology in the sense of left hemisphere, right hemisphere. Obviously, it's more technical.
Yes.
But I think it was a powerful idea to recognize, okay, we are being very mechanical. We are being overly rationalistic. And then actually through Ian McGilchrist, Jonathan Pageau, I'm sure you like Jonathan Pageau as well. I really like the symbolic world, the way he describes narrative, and then the meta narrative, let's say. And then John Vervaeke has been another guy I've followed in and out. I think there's a few more other characters, but I can't remember the top of my head. But I feel like they've been the key kind of thinkers, let's say, that I've been influenced by. So yeah.
Very good. Yeah, I mean, that group of people especially has been influential to my thinking as well. I was a guest on a podcast not too long ago that's up on my channel, actually. I spoke to Kara Nodrick and Rogerio Marx about in response to this particular dialogue, or trialogue, I guess maybe you would call it, between Ian McGilchrist, Jonathan Vervaeke, or John Vervaeke, I don't know if it's Jonathan, John Vervaeke, and Daniel Schmachtenberger.
Yeah, I'm not too sure.
I had never heard of Daniel Schmachtenberger before I saw these. Right, I saw they were on it. I was like, I don't want to watch this. I don't know who this guy is. He was sort of he played this this intermediary point, right? So what I found very interesting about that, and it sort of stemmed from my interest in McGilchrist's work, right? It's interesting that you mentioned sort of Jordan Peterson as a gateway into these thinkers. Jordan Peterson was also my gateway into psychology, right? I had been thinking about the Renaissance for a while at that point. I think it was, I've mentioned this elsewhere, but really I had spent my undergrad studying the Renaissance. I was initially very interested in 14th century Italian vernacular poetry, so the poetry of Petrarch and Dante.
Okay.
I went on to do a PhD in Renaissance studies, specifically because I learned as a result of my coursework in undergraduate that really most of the Renaissance was being done by people who wrote in Latin, by people who were interested in, say, reforming education, by people who were interested, say, in building these kind of parallel infrastructures in order to reform society, right? Not that they were against classical institutions, but they were liminal figures typically when it came to universities. And they sort of went between church and political institutions, maybe city institutions, right? They weren't Renaissance humanism, this sort of, well, it's a 19th century term, but this sort of intellectual underpinning of the Renaissance is something that was not localized to a particular institution. And I had started to study, well, not study, I had started watching Jordan Peterson's lectures, and I was actually really struck by how pertinent they were to my experience in academia, particularly as he talks about things like the sort of postmodernist thinking and the predilection for power as sort of, right, the cynical view of the world that really everyone is interested in power, everyone does everything, high cultural movements, all of this is really, is for the sake of acquiring power or wealth or pleasure or display or something like that, right? So I was really interested in that because I had felt that for a while in academia, and I was very confused by it because I started very young. I started my PhD when I was 21, and I was just sort of, some naive kid that's like, hey, this is going to be great. We're going to study the Renaissance. Don't you think Latin is cool? And I didn't get received very well with that kind of attitude in a few places. But Peterson actually led me, right? The sort of the confluence of Peterson's thinking and this idea of the Renaissance led me to McGilchrist.
Interesting.
In The Master and His Emissary, at the very end, if you recall the argument at the end, right, he has this sort of, the first, what, 2/3 of the book is more neuroscience focused. It's talking about, say, the neuroanatomy of the hemispheres and sort of the phenomenology, the experiential phenomenology of the hemispheres, how they work, how it feels to us to sort of shift between the different hemispheric modes of attention. But the last third of the book is an argument that it's sort of a macro cultural argument, right? That society or societies can shift between sort of a balance of prioritizing left hemispheric attentive modes or right hemispheric attentive modes. So maybe just for our audience, if you're not familiar with McGilchrist's work, right, just very basically his hemisphere hypothesis is that the left hemisphere is this kind of very focused attention, right? There you go, Master and His Emissary, that's the book. This very focused attention, right? It's actually Peterson comments on this as well, right? It's the 2% of your visual field right in the middle of your eye, right? It pins things down. It's about apprehension, right? Using things, grasping things. It does not, it sort of time slows down for the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is interested in wholes. Gestalt is the term he likes to use, right? Wholes in the German sense. It's not about apprehending, it's about comprehending. It's not about the pinpoint focus right at the middle of your eye. It's about the panoramic contextual view, something like that. It was actually on that vision point that I found him, since Peterson talks about that in one of his lecture series. But he has this argument, right? He has this argument at the end of Master and His Emissary where he talks about the Renaissance as being a moment where European society, right, sort of loosely understood, had this sort of moment of realization that it needed to embrace a more right hemispheric perspective of the world, something like that, right? He talks about several of these different points. I guess my first question is, what did you think of this argument from McGilchrist, right? And my second question is, do you think that there is something along those lines that needs to go on now, that could go on now with respect to this kind of idea of the Renaissance, a sort of perceptive shift? How did you understand this?
I think just before I even answer the question, I think it must have been very fascinating from your side. Someone who's very, you've got, your expertise on the Renaissance is amazing. So when you see that argument, so I'm trying to like, how did you frame it when you saw it? I just want you to expand a little bit more, because I'm curious, because from my side, I see it, again, how you explained it, I just see it as one grand pattern, let's say. And if you want to absolutely simplify it, just to simplify it, and going back, because again, we're like a microcosm, and then there's the macrocosm, which is society, let's say. Let's use that language as well. And again, I just want to frame it as we go through things in life, and sometimes we might have to die internally to be reborn once again. It's that kind of death rebirth kind of pattern. So again, you know more about the Renaissance, but from my limited knowledge, it seems there was a death prior to the Renaissance, and there was a rebirth. And so with the rebirth, obviously there comes certain things that occur in society. And then after the rebirth, what happens, civilization might stagnate in a certain way, and then it might have to die off, So framing it in today's age, I know you mentioned, I'm jumping the question a little bit.
Yeah, no, go on.
But I know you mentioned today's, the last few decades, the seeds have been planted for, a new kind of Renaissance, let's say. And I do agree, but not to be cynical, but there has to be a bit more death from a collective sense, not literally, obviously, but needs to be collectively, there has to be a bit more downturn from the civilizational point of view, in my opinion, for people to kind of not to sound new agey, but to wake up, you know, to realize, okay, cool, you know, the direction we're heading in right now, all the superficiality we're absorbed in as a culture, this is not conducive to a flourishing civilization. This is not good. We're making idols out of things that shouldn't be idols, you know. And so I don't know how you feel about that. But I think that's kind of my overall take where we are today. I do agree the seeds have been planted, but still doesn't mean we're going on the up now. Now this is the century of the up. Maybe it's the century of progressively, you know, civilization going down. I'm not being negative. I'm naturally a very optimistic human being. And you know, technology is a beautiful thing as well. I'm not anti-technology. I think technology can be a good. But again, technology in itself is neutral. Depends who's holding the technology. And so an evil person that holds the technology, they will use it for evil. A good person using technology will use it for good. Again, pretty simple. So I don't know, just so now wrapping it back up in terms of Emil Gilchrist, when you saw that Renaissance argument, I just want you to elaborate just personally. I find it interesting. How did that really resonate with what you learned and how you viewed the Renaissance, or it did, but it was just a absolutely brand new perspective that, oh wow, like I never thought of it that way before.
Well, yeah, I have some questions to follow up on, what you said there, but I want to make sure I address your question. So, you know, for me, I would say very briefly that encountering that argument, right, and it's right, it's an interesting hypothesis at the end there, right? He presents you know, a lot of evidence, but it's not exhaustive, right? So but what I think it did was it helped me think in a particular mode. And that particular mode was, maybe all of these different elements of the Renaissance are interconnected. Maybe there is something kind of at the root of them, which they are all tied to. Maybe it's some sort of central, you know, something happens, right?
Yes.
Something is happening that's at the core. There's some sort of phenomenon, and then these, you know, various art forms or manifestations of things that we look at and say, ah, yes, look there's the Renaissance, are an offshoot of that. And for a while, I had really struggled to understand what exactly the Renaissance was, right? It's sort of, yeah, to be called an intellectual or expert in the Renaissance or something like that. I mean, I guess to a certain extent, I guess, right? That's what the PhD says, but it's like, you know, I spent many, many, many years not being able to say it all, right? I was a Renaissance studies PhD. And I couldn't tell you what it was.
Yeah, interesting.
Completely honestly, I could not tell you what it was. And I didn't know where to look, right? I knew what a lot of people had said about the Renaissance. I know that scholars had said, well, you know, there's this kind of Renaissance, this is Renaissance, and, you know, the Renaissance was doing this, and the Renaissance was doing this, and it's got this art, and, you know, maybe it was about excellence, or maybe it was about art in general, or something like that. But I was really struggling to find some sort of unifying element for this. You know, why would painting and writing about, you know, Latin works, why would that be connected? I don't, you know, I don't understand. How is this philosophy connected to education, and how is the education, you know, connected to politics? Because of course, a number of people are very, Renaissance scholars are very interested in Renaissance political thought, and that somehow that's a bedrock of our modern, you know, our modern understanding of politics and political systems. Which granted that scholarship, but I still couldn't find a unifying element to that. And I think McGilchrist was the first person who I had read who proposed that there was a unifying psychological phenomenon that occurred underneath that, right? Essentially, his proposal is that there is sort of a developmental or a pathological imbalance, or I think I've referred to it in the past as a disequilibration of the way that the hemispheres collaborate with one another, right? And it's something like, right, he's very particular on this idea of asymmetry. That the proper balance of the hemispheres is asymmetrical. It is not symmetrical. It is that the majority of the time, one should be navigating the world with a right hemispheric perspective, and sparingly and in concentrated moments, use a left hemispheric perspective. However, there are configurations of society and there are configurations of an environment that we tend to build maybe that push that asymmetry toward the left hemisphere. And that's his mention there, right? That's why he titles the book The Master and His Emissary off of this parable of Nietzsche,
Yes.
where the emissary represents the left hemisphere and the master the right hemisphere. And there's this sort of tragedy in this parable where the emissary comes to dominate the master, seizes control from him, and then ruins the kingdom.
Yes.
And that there's something like that, right? That there's something like that underpinning maybe our current circumstances, and that there was something like that underpinning Nietzsche's 19th century, right?
Yes.
That the death of God that Nietzsche talks about is connected to that imbalance. It's not that, somehow, God has been killed and God can never be believed in again, but it's something like the way that we've organized society is we've completely blinded ourselves to the ability to perceive of things that transcend material existence. And that is responsible for the generation of the socialistic crises of the 20th century.
Yes. 1000.
So just to, I guess, to sum that up, right? That what was most interesting for me was that it was a psychological route, and a psychological route that was occurring. Okay, it occurred collectively, culturally, right? But then, the other proposition about that too, which was also moving for me, and Peterson was saying similar things to this at the same time, was this Renaissance phenomenon, right? This transformation in perspective, this recalibrating of the asymmetry between the hemispheres is something that occurs in the life of the individual and then gets, aggregated into culture.
Yes. And this is the problem with, again, Western civilization. I'm not going to bash that. There's loads of good Protestants, obviously, but in terms of the Protestant Reformation, the consequences of the Protestant Reformation, you remove the monastery, the monastic disappeared. And if you have, from my lens, how I view, let's say, Christianity, it's a combination, really, when you look at history, with the university, the church, which is the community as well, and then the monastery, which is actually the source of wisdom, insight. And that's the right hemispheric part as well, if you're using the Ian McGilchrist kind of language. And so with the Protestant Reformation, there's high churches, obviously, in the Protestant grouping, with Anglicanism, Lutheranism, they're more high church. So there is still a sense of reverence and awe to the divine. But especially when you look from the outside to the States, obviously you're from the States. From the outside looking into the States, it's like, well, your version of Christianity is incredibly moralistic. It's incredibly sola scriptura. It's very focused on the Bible, which is actually ironically left hemispheric, because you're being overly analytical with the Bible. And actually, in reality, Christianity is not a moralizing religion. Christianity is actually something to embody. That's Eastern Orthodoxy, for example. It's to bear your cross and climb the mountain. That's the point of Christianity. But it's like we've lost that. And part of, for the last 500 years, the death of God is been amplified by the loss of the monastic, in my opinion. We've lost just that tangible element. And that's why Jung was always fascinating to me, because going through his collected works, he always had this, people don't like to see it. And I think he was trying to, go beyond religion itself and try and, he wasn't forming something new, but he was trying to put ideas so for people to carry his work along. But I did sense there was a battle with him and Christ, in my opinion, looking at Carl Jung. There was this sense of a battle with him and Christ. And same with Nietzsche, technically. Nietzsche's, famously when he died, it was the mode of Dionysus and the mode of Christ when he was. So what was my point with Jung? I think my point with bringing up Jung, I'm losing my trail of thoughts.
Well, I'm very
Yeah, go for it.
interested.
Yeah, pick it up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this. I have read I've read a good bit of Jung.
Mm,
I've also, been exposed to Jung as mediated by Peterson and, less directly by McGilchrist, but McGilchrist is also very clearly there are a number of ideas that he
yes.
picks up on, and
Yes.
he talks about Jung to a certain extent. And um, when you say that Jung he had this struggle with Christ, or he had this battle with Christ, what do you mean by that?
Well, if you read this, if you want to understand someone's work, this is my take. If you
Mm.
want to understand someone's work, you have to understand the man. You have to
Hmm.
understand the human being. So that's why I
Yes.
mentioned, look, the first thing I mentioned was the reason why I got into what I got into was I
Mm.
had my own personal struggles in life. I made a few
Mm.
mistakes. So, and you have to actually analyze. So when people look at anything in life, you mentioned about the Renaissance. You started your PhD incredibly young, and for some reason you can kind of frame, the Renaissance until Emma Gilchrist kind of gave you a new perspective on it, and it was like, oh, psychological. There's a psychological kind of, and that's my point. You got the theoretical, but there has to be a practical element. So going back to Jung, when you read his autobiography, I forgot what it's called. Is an obvious.
Memories, dreams, reflections.
That's it,
Kind of
correct.
his semi-autobiography, right?
Yeah.
A fair bit of that's written by Agnella Joffe.
Yeah. But either way, you see his childhood, and there's this sense of he found Jesus Christ scary. He was like,
Mm.
whoa. Like, and I find that strange because I never, I was
Mm.
atheist for a while. I was into, Buddhism and
Mhm,
didn't
mhm,
make
mhm.
the New Year, but I never found Jesus Christ scary. And I was like, well, how does that impact your perspective on
Mm.
the religion when you automatically from a child, you already see Jesus Christ is a scary figure. And that's what if you notice as he got older, he traveled to India, he met with the gurus, and he,
Mm.
he never was able to go to Rome. There was some sort of, from my reading into Jung, there was some sort of battle because Rome is obviously the bastion of ancient Rome, the West, the grandeur, the order,
Mhm,
but
mhm,
also Roman Catholicism as well. St. Peter's Church, and
mhm,
and
mhm.
there was this sense like I would like to go, but it might be too
Mhm.
much psychologically for Jung to handle because he was so in touch with, let's say,
Yeah.
his unconscious. Um, so that was my take with Jung. That's why I found it quite
Mm.
interesting. He didn't have that relationship because and he's right. There's a famous I forgot what collected works, but he mentioned that the European man seeks wide and far for spirituality and for the symbolism and for like the mysticism. But in reality, it will never replace Christianity. It will
Mm.
never replace the soul
Yeah.
of this continent, really.
I
Um,
think that's psychology and religion.
I think so. I think so. But and for me, it's like, well, I have to take when I read, I take that seriously. It's like, well,
Mhm.
I don't come from a Hindu background. I
Mm.
don't come from a Buddhist background. I don't come
Yeah.
from, and I'm from this continent, and we have
Mhm.
to. And so going back to the Renaissance, we have to look after what we have. We can't just say, oh, the culture is incredibly cynical against
Mm.
Christianity. It's terrible. You wonder why the death of God is, of course, amplified.
Mm.
It sees it as horrible religion, but some other religions get a bit more. Oh wow, this is so exotic and beautiful. It's like no, there's beautiful and exotic things. It's just maybe the monastery is something we're missing. Maybe the
Mm.
prominence of the wisdom and the insights that we had previously, and now it's gone. Maybe we
Mm.
need that back in the culture.
Mm.
Why can't we have our wise guys in the continent?
Mm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, go for it, go
So,
for it.
so I'm very interested. I'm also interested in this. Maybe to talk a little bit about this. Conversion and sort of religious experience you had, right?
Mm,
So, I myself went. Although I would say that I never reached this point in my own religious journey where I said like, oh, Christianity, that's dumb, sort of a thing. right, or moved away from it. I was raised Methodist, actually, right? So raised in an American Protestant tradition.
Okay. Okay.
But I would say, right, that in my college years and yeah, sort of early graduate school, yeah, I sort of accepted myself as a Christian, but I came to realize later that I didn't really live as a Christian. And I had sort of embraced some of the teachings of the world, right? Something like that.
Yes. Yes.
And however, in so doing and kind of collecting this experience in life and, doing things wrong, going through pain, yeah, maybe hurting people and being hurt at certain times, right? Realizing that was taking place, that I was drawn to Roman Catholicism. Right? So I back in 2019, I made a profession of faith in the Catholic Church, and I was very closely drawn to it, and I had become drawn to it actually through singing. I had, kind of a side job as a liturgical musician all throughout my graduate school years. And I was very drawn to the Catholic Mass, and the more traditional, the higher the right, the more the images, sort of the more graphic the crucifix. Like I was like, I need to be here. I need to be in this place. This is where I'm supposed to go and spend my time and do this. And so, I found for me in particular that the presence of images, right? The emphasis on darkness, the acceptance and the pointing out of suffering, right? Like, for example, in a Catholic church, as a kid, I was always struck by the fact that when you walk into a Catholic church, at the very center is a cross with Christ hanging on it, bleeding, dying, suffering. That is not what you see when you walk into a Protestant church. When you walk into a Protestant church, you usually see a blank cross. It's empty.
Yes.
And there's usually this kind of this idea that, oh, well, we emphasize the resurrection, not the crucifixion, or something like that, right? I heard that a few places. But I did notice that increasingly, sort of, at least in my experience, when I would go to Protestant churches, there was more of this emphasis on, hey, God loves you, everything's going to be great, everything's going to be fine.
Yes.
But then, of course, how do you make sense of, the book of Job? God loves you. God loves you so much, he's going to bet with the devil that you're going to give up if you suffer and have everything taken away from you tragically. So I'm curious maybe to learn a little bit more about what that process was like for you, that arrival maybe at Christianity. You are a practicing Catholic now, or are you practicing Orthodox?
Well, my fiance is from an Orthodox background, but we do Catholic Mass. But I'm very one foot in, one foot out in terms of I like Orthodoxy quite a lot, to be honest with you.
Yes.
It makes a lot of sense to me, but I do go to a Catholic Mass. So yeah, my journey with my spirituality, let's say, is I think it's ironically, again, the New Age, getting into the New Age communities and, dabbling in different ideas and actually Eckhart Tolle, reading The Power of Now. I know it's, I think I found it a very powerful, very simple, very powerful book. And I actually, through reading it, I did get this sense of presence, a bit like, and and through that, I got into Buddhism for a period of time. And especially when I started going out with my fiance, she was a Buddhist pretty much, and she was into Buddhism for 5 years. So she really did teach me Buddhism from a very practical lens as well. Regarding Christianity, it was just a very organic process in terms of the calling back to the church. I think the issue with, let's say, certain perspectives, it doesn't have, because Buddhism, it's all about crashing the meta narrative at the end. I think that's how I can perceive Buddhism. It's like enlightenment. It's to destroy the meta narrative. And there's something, I know it's a cliche, but a lot of people say it's nihilistic. When you really reflect on it, it can become quite nihilistic, And even though there's definitely parallel when you look at the two, big traditions, Buddhism and Christianity, the monastic centers have been massive compared to the other traditions. They've been very deeply intertwined with the faith. And so with Buddhism, I felt like there wasn't enough structure, let's call it that. There wasn't enough. There is structure, obviously, and there's dogmas around even in Buddhism. But personally, for me, it just, at the end, it didn't seem so structured. And so and going back to Christianity, obviously in the modern age, it's the worship of the self, let's say, ideologically. It's me. And in Christianity, in the end, it has that. I'm not trying to make the same comparison, but of course, there's truths in every domain. And in Christianity, it has that Buddhist sense of denial. There is a denial element. You have to deny yourself. Famously, Jesus does say, deny yourself and you'll find yourself. It's that's really an important caveat in Christianity. And there are certain, and the dogmas, as you know, in the Catholic Church, it's really thought out. And you've heard Jordan Peterson make the remark with Jung saying that Catholicism is the most sane human beings can get. I think you probably. And to a certain extent, I do agree. I do agree with the structure and the order and the way everything is so thought out. But so there was like an intellectual process in getting back into Christianity. But I would say, just like any spiritual journey, there were certain experiences, there were certain moments, certain synchronicities, let's say, God calling, like very strange things. And when I first went to Bulgaria, I went to Nevsky, the massive cathedral, Orthodox cathedral, and they were doing the Divine Liturgy in Nevsky, and I went in, I was like, wow, in the atmosphere, and it's very dark, but it's very massive as well, and you hear the very ancient Orthodox chants and the incense and even the aromas around the place, and this seriousness. It's a very serious, in a good way. It's like you must be very respectful. Females should wear veils, and men have to be very dressed up appropriately to get into it. And it's this reverence, this awe, this sense of respect. And me and my fiance, we were there for well over 2 hours. Let's say we sat down for a bit and we just soaked in the atmosphere. And I felt, wow, I'm at home a little bit. That's how I felt. I felt I'm at home. I couldn't let go. I wasn't a Christian at that time, and I was still into different spirit, but I couldn't let go of that feeling. Like that it wasn't just a feeling; it was a truth. Like there's a truth to this. And how do I ground the truth? Like again, using Ian McGilchrist's language, that was the right hemispheric moment. How can I ground that in the left hemispheric analytical way? How can I do this? So I had to ponder a little while. I had to kind of, and that's why 8 months later I did go back to a Catholic church. And to be honest, my fiance actually really likes Catholicism because it's like the halfway house between the preaching element in terms of teaching the stories / you have the rituals, the practices. Whilst she would say, oh, Orthodoxy, even though it's beautiful, sometimes it's a lot of you're just standing there doing the sign of the cross motions, and they're singing a lot, but I don't get what's going on. That's what was her perspective. So that's why we've kind of got into Catholicism from a two-way street between me and her. I would say it's still been a journey. I was going to say this year, it's 2024. 2023, it has been a journey in terms of learning, and again, in terms of my knowledge of the church fathers. I need to start gaining the knowledge with the church fathers, but it's a journey, obviously, and it takes time. I just it's an amazing journey, to be honest with you. And I think back to civilization, I do. The cynical, nihilistic, and destructive natures, it's terrible because people focus on the rationalistic element. It's like, how can this be true? How can let's say that's the key thing, really, the resurrection. It's like, well, you can have your battle with it. I'm not saying I didn't have my battles with that idea. Of course, we live in the modern world, but also you have to understand, even in science, you have to. From my lens, it's like the Big Bang Theory, even though it's not really, it's still a mainstream idea. Let's call it that. The Big Bang Theory.
Mm.
It's still based on a miracle, you know, an explosion, and then life came out of the explosion. It's like, well, if you like that theory, that's you're believing in a miracle. That's a miracle as much as you want to frame it. So you're telling me I can't believe in the miracle of this divine human being resurrected? Like, how can I? It's still a miracle, whether you like to frame it in a different way or not. So I've kind of that's the point of a faith journey. It's faith. You know,
Mm.
you go to a Catholic church. It's they always say the mystery of faith. It's the mystery.
Mm-hmm.
It's not blind. It's not blind faith. There is rationale and it's very well thought out. But there has to come to a point where you kind of have to let go of being that left hemispheric, overly analytical character because it does lead you into no man's land.
Mm.
And one point I would like to mention as well, it's the fact is, if you don't believe, you're going to pick your sacrifices, you're going to pick your poison, you're going to pick something, you're going to idolize something. Of course you are. So if let's say we're both going to the church, at the end, the goal is to be as Christ-like as we can be. That's the
Mm.
goal. And we are, let's say, sinners, and we're going to fall every single day, but that's fine. But we're trying to climb an archetypal hill. You know, we're trying in our Christian paradigm, that's who we're aiming for, to be Christ-like. And so I always say this to people, imagine a world that human beings, let's say every single human being embodied the Christ ideal. How would the world be? And objectively, you can say it would be a better world. It would be. And so when people are you know, there's no rational, it's like that's rational. Like embody, try and go to the church, trying to really like, you know, have reverence, have awe, you know, we kneel in the church, as you know, that be reverent and really like say, look, I can be a narcissist, let's say in society, let's say civilization has this narcissistic kind of, and you know what? Let me be humble. Let me bow down to something greater than me. Let me bow back to this ideal. And I think that's very rational. And I think and obviously there's still a few more things I want to configure along my journey, but
Mm-hmm.
that's it. It's an embodiment thing. You can't overly theorize the process. You have, it's very practical, in my opinion. And so yeah, that's it.
Okay. Yeah. So your your fiance now, I believe her name is Anna, correct?
Yeah, Annie. Yeah.
Annie. Okay. Is her profile right? Is she also talking about similar things, right? So your profile is very clearly taking this kind of practical approach to exploring Christianity and maybe exploring some of the divine and more traditional rituals and bringing this to the fore in combination
Hmm.
with some of your explorations of say Carl Jung or Peterson or McGilchrist. And I think at one point you mentioned to me as well, you also did a bit of studying of clinical psychology or neuroscience to a certain
Yeah,
extent.
I'm still finishing my applied neuroscience postgrad.
Okay. Okay. So
So
you're currently, so
yes, yeah.
your postgraduate project, is this
I've still so
a master's program or?
I'm doing a postgrad diploma. I'm doing it up to
Okay.
that level because
Okay.
I think I explained to you as well. I want to get into religion and theology. Long term, I do want to delve in that realm.
Okay.
My
Okay.
personal reasons, but yeah.
Very good. And so is Annie's profile as well? Is she also talking about religious
Yeah,
themes?
yeah.
What's going on with her work right now?
Well, she's focused on more the history of Christianity, let's say. She's focused on more
I
the
see. Okay.
facts of what actually, you know, what were the disciples doing? What were, you know, and she's focused on more being a journalist in the pro because she comes from a journalistic background. And so she's been again analytical in terms of understanding what actually happened, you know, what and beyond just Jesus. I mean, what happened with the church? What's the history behind even very obscure niche elements regarding certain dogmas and ideas? So yeah, she's got this journalistic approach with Christianity, but she's a musician. She's got an amazing voice and she does sing. So she's kind of integrating that, and that's why the Proverbs project was an overlap between Christianity and you know her musical kind of talents. So that's the two things she focuses on right now.
I see. Okay. So a historical, so primarily a historical approach to Christianity,
Yes. Yes.
from this journalistic background with maybe a bit of music and performing arts
Yes.
sprinkled in, something
Yes.
like that.
Yes. Yes.
Very good.
Yeah. Very
Very good. So that's nice. Your profiles, then your two projects here, sort of your broader projects, then have this sort of harmony to them in
Yes.
the way I suppose that man and woman should have
Yeah,
harmony
yeah.
with each other. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. So right now, if you were to say that the two of you are aiming at something, or at least insofar as you can speak of yourself, right? What are you particularly aiming at with this religious, right, with this exploration of Christianity together? What do you hope to arrive at?
Yeah, no, that's a very hard question. So thank you for that.
Hey, I'm just I'm just
Yeah, I
curious
know,
if
I know, I
there's
know, I
something
know,
that
I know, I
you
know,
had thought of. I'd love
I
for
know, I know, I know.
maybe there are people out there, right? I
Good
think about
question.
this just in
Good
terms
question.
of maybe people who are listening, right?
Yeah, yeah, no,
And
I know.
if there's somebody maybe who's thinking along those same lines as you, right?
Yes, yes,
Maybe if you have this same value in mind, right, you'll be able to
yes,
find
yes,
each other by making it explicit.
yes, yes. No, no, no. I agree. I agree. I think for me, it's more the re-education. So that's where we both align. It's the re-education of Christianity because I think it's, again, people have a cynical eye towards it because of the current ideologies that,
Mhm,
mask their perception on the Christian paradigm. Let's call it that. It kind of,
mhm,
so I think my job is, how I see it is I'm not very, I'm not into, I enjoy watching apologetics in terms
mhm,
of, a Muslim, versus a Christian, and they're trying to debate their religion. I find that as interesting to watch sometimes, but I don't, that's not a good mode of
mhm,
teaching the general public, let's say. I don't think at the end it's not the right way to do it. And I go back to the point I made earlier. It's when you're trying to, you want to be as authentic as you can be, and you want to be honest with yourself, your personal journey. Why are you in it? What's your aim? What's your are you trying to be integral with what you're doing? So there is that element, and I do think it's capturing hearts rather than minds solely.
mhm,
Obviously, there has to be that element. So the heart element, again, been the theme today has been a bit of Ian McGilchrist. The heart
mhm,
obviously is related to the right hemisphere part. And we do have to kind of get the gestalts and kind of look, here's the beauty of Christianity. Here's the grand, think about, I'm sure you've seen the film of Jim Caviezel's The Passion,
Passion of the Christ, yes.
yes, and that hits home as well. That,
Mhm,
just the profound, oh, that's what Christian, oh, it's very heavy, and that's the point. That is the point to a certain extent. Obviously, he resurrects, and Orthodoxy, you got the Pantocrator that looks up. So Orthodoxy does focus more on the resurrection, but even so, that the crucifixion is massively important to the religion. So I think it's a mixture of education with an open heart, with
mhm,
humility, but not from a ideologically possessed Christian
mhm,
perspective, because it's not an you shouldn't be possessed by Christianity. It's not an ideology. It should be a way of living, the way of
mhm,
embodying, the way of seeking truth, the way of, again, I've used it that
mhm,
type, the words climbing the archetypal mountain. Let's say that's the point. It should make you a better human being, and so that should be the focus, and that's what I try to focus on. I don't focus on, this is not so good, you shouldn't be talking about other religion. That's wrong. I talk about other perspectives to a certain
mhm,
extent. I do.
mhm,
I just have that humility to admit, look, okay, that's
mhm,
my paradigm, but I'm willing to understand the other paradigms around it.
mhm,
Um, so I think that's my approach.
mhm,
See, like I said, Annie's has got the journalistic side, but it just
mhm,
naturally intertwines, and I'm sure we're going to have more projects down the line. Um, but part of it's just the education process, the unveiling of life, the um, trying to be a better human being as well. And
mhm,
yeah, and I again, just to reiterate, it's just incredibly important. It's the embodiment of the perspective. It's not about moralizing. It's not about you can't do this, you shouldn't. That's wrong. That's not the way to go about the Christian perspective. I really, it's the famous parable of Christ and Jesus Christ and the adulterous woman, the stoning episode. And Jesus was like, no, if you're a sinner, don't do it. And obviously they didn't do it. And Jesus helped them. But then Jesus still said, look, here's the truth. What you're doing is not good. Stop sinning, you know? So there's that's my point. There's a fine line with everything in life. Um, but hopefully that makes sense anyways.
Yeah, yeah. I think that certainly sounds quite 21st century Renaissance to me. So trying to resurrect, revivify, help people embody an authentic and open Christian way of life that is rooted in its traditional wisdom and its traditional culture. That is certainly something that many of the progenitors of the Renaissance, right, Renaissance humanists especially, were very interested in. Desiderius Erasmus in particular was really quite interested in that specifically. So yeah, like I said, that seems quite 21st century Renaissance to me. So everyone, please, if you are interested in following Philippe and his fiancee Annie as they work to revivify a Christian way of life today through social media, through their various projects. Please support them on Patreon. Please support their Instagram profile. Support them on X. Their information is down in the description to this video. Philippe, before we sign off today, is there any wisdom, any last remarks we didn't have a chance to get to today you'd like to share with our audience before we sign off?
I think just remain optimistic. Just don't be don't be that, you know, if you're in a bad place right now, don't think it's the end. And also with the civilizational element, that's the point, you know, the Renaissance, we're looking up, we're trying to strive for better civilization. And I think the more people talk about these ideas, the more optimistic we are, and the more we're optimistic about technology. Because going back to, you know, everyone's quite doom and gloom with the technological element. In reality, it's like, let's focus on building up the wisdom in society once more. Let's talk about these ideas. And in effect, actually, the technology is not going to seem so evil, you know, because we can't run away from this technology. It's here, and there's goods, otherwise we wouldn't be connecting right now. And so we have to remain optimistic, not blindly optimistic, but optimistic through our learning, through trying to be a better human being. So that's my last piece of wisdom.
Very, very good. Maybe we can counter some of that pessimism by cultivating some of that virtue or that right goodness of character through careful study and attention to ourselves. Right.
Yeah.
So very good. Philippe, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for joining 21st Century Renaissance. And thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time. Take care.